Welcome to In Other Words, the podcast where we explore the worlds that open up when language travels across borders and meet the voices who make that journey possible, the translators. I'm your host, Namrata, and in today's episode, we are joined by V. Iswarya, a translator, critic, and teacher of English literature at the Manipal Academy of Higher Education in Bangalore. Her work moves across the classroom, the page, and the public sphere. She's been shortlisted for the Mosi Prize, has translated essays from B. J. Mohan for Frontline, and her first book length translation, Perumal Murugan's memoir, Students Etched in Memory, is out with Penguin Random House India in 2025. We'll be talking about what it means to carry a writer's voice across languages, how translation shapes literary memory, and the challenges of staying true not just to the words, but to the tone, texture, and cultural resonance. Welcome, Ishwarya. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Namrata, and a hearty welcome to all your audience on this podcast. I'd love to explore what makes translation so magical effort.
Sure. So let's start from the beginning. What drew you to the world of literary translations, and how did your academic background in English literature shape this journey?
Okay. So I studied Tamil until my school final years. And so I was introduced quite strongly to the foundation of classical Tamil literature, which, if you know, is like a classical language, goes back like a couple millennia or probably more. And so the school curriculum more or less focuses on a lot of ancient writings and very little of contemporary writings. So we didn't actually have a chance to be introduced much to modern Tamil writing at all at school level. And from that part, I did a couple of foundation language courses in undergraduation and so on. And then I drifted away from Tamil for nearly 16 years. So then I go on and do my, UG, PG, MPhil, PhD, everything in English and focusing on English drama. And so at some point, I was reintroduced to Tamil because just random coincidences. I stumble upon a friend who sort of tells me, hey, you should read this book, sort of thing. We meet at a book fair for the first time, and she gets me a book, signs it, and gives it to me. And so I am gradually sort of drawn back into reading Tamil. And I realize, oh God, I've been out of touch with this language for a long time. And after all, I had not actually studied anything in contemporary Tamil writings at all. So 3 years back, if you asked me who are the three most important Tamil writers, I would have kind of probably named somebody from 10th century or something, So that would have been the situation. And so thanks to this friend, I kind of got back to a little bit of reading, but that was still just driven by curiosity, just, okay, Tamil's on the side sort of thing. But then I think there is a key moment when the Mori Prize was launched by, incidentally, the same friend I had met long ago. And, I had all sorts of worries about, is this a conflict of interest considering that you are my friend and you are launching this? And she's like, shut up and submit. We are not the judges. So it was, it was a push I really needed. And so I thought, okay, I'll try my hand at translation. And then at that point, I'd also come across like this tiny novelette called, I'm calling it tiny, but it's like roughly 15,000 words. So I don't know if it's even tiny. So I kind of like came across this, and then I sort of said, oh, this sounds very interesting. This is what I want to translate. And then realized that that goes over the word limit. And I had to then scramble for a story to translate. But that was such a happy accident because the story that I then picked, thanks to, again, suggestions from other friends, was one called Ammayapam, which kind of got me a special mention in the Mori Prize. And that's the story that still stays very close to my heart. And maybe we'll talk more about that later when we, talk about instances of translation. But that's really what got me into this fray. And so I really needed that push to say, for someone to say, yeah, you can do this, go ahead and try.
That's so fascinating, Ishwara, because, as such, if you look at it, writing is a very solitary kind of job. You're just sitting isolated at your places, at your desks, and just typing or writing. And then there are so many such heartwarming incidents where friends have played the role of being the motivator or the person who's constantly pushing or just encouraging. And that's just beautiful. That brings out the beauty of writing. So, moving on to our next question, you have translated works by both B.J. Mohan and Perumal Murugan, writers with distinct voices and registers. So, how do you approach preserving the uniqueness of a writer's style while translating into English?
Fascinating question. To be honest, when you say styles, I also have to sort of, mentally make a note that, oh, these people have very different styles within their own body of work. So Perumal Murugan's fiction is so different from Perumal Murugan's non-fiction. And then if you take up Jayamohan, that's like an entire set of registers altogether. So he can write like, non-fiction, that is philosophical essays, which are deeply, you can see the sentence constructions and figure out that there is some amount of this thought process that has definitely happened in English. It that kind of comes across in the, or at least a certain amount of Western influence in the way you look at the, structuring of sentences there and so on. Whereas when you look at his, the stories and dialogue and the dialects used in those are like a completely different kind of style. And he already uses some 3 4 different kinds of dialects to set his stories in, so he doesn't write just about one region. So the present collection that I just finished translating is set somewhere in North Kerala, and so there's like a huge Malayalam mixed sort of register that comes across in that. And the initial story that I picked up for translation is set in the Kerala Tamil Nadu border region sort of thing, around the Nagarkoil district where he grew up. So and so you find a lot of these different registers in their writing. And in some cases, for instance, that dialect is definitely not going to come through. It's not possible to retain it. And so instead, what you aim for is to see if you can make that rhythm make sense. Like, for instance, when I translate an essay on philosophical or political topics by Jay Mohan, I try and write in a style where I want my readers to follow the thought process as clearly as if somebody straight away wrote up in English. And so at that point, I'm not really trying to replicate the register. I'm trying for a certain majesty of prose that exists when somebody gives you authoritative statements about say politics or philosophy, or like, or when they're making certain categorical pronouncements. That kind of language has to come through, and I think that is what I attempted with the Savarkar essay that he wrote. I guess it really went viral with Kuha and others talking about it. So that all that I was aiming at that point was to try and bring in that sense of gravity, weight, and balance to those sentences, to kind of signal that this is an important topic and he has some very important things to say on this important topic sort of thing. On the other hand, when you translate like, a memoir, it's very light, and Perumal Murugan's sentences are very short in the first place, like very short sentences. Sometimes 3 sentences, full stop. I mean, 3 words and full stop, sort
Wow.
of thing. You know, so that if you replicate that style in English, it's going to look extremely choppy and awkward. It works in Tamil, but it's not going to work in English. So it's really about finding an English style that works for that author's ideas and expressions, more than just recapturing the original style in the target language, I think.
True, true. I agree with you. So let's talk about the invisible labor behind translation. So can you share a moment or a phrase in your translation work that you struggled with and how you eventually resolved it? And what does that say about the invisible labor behind translation?
Oh, yeah. There are so many different sources of struggle. One that I can think of, like, is when I had dialect words in Jaymohan's Tamil. And again, I don't speak that dialect. So I had to like pretty much call up some five different friends and like, independently verify with them, like, does this really mean great grandmother and that kind of thing, and so those, of course, are like the basic sort of groundwork you're expected to do. But sometimes what happens is, when you are unable to sort of make sense at all and you don't want to disturb the author way too many times, like you've just sent him an email 3 days ago, and like, you don't want to keep badgering them, and then you had to go look up, these dictionaries of dialects. In Perumal Murugan's case, he had put out a dictionary of the Kongu dialect of Tamil, in which I found the word Kumbakattu. Because the context also was very unintuitive. The word Kumbakattu is used as a nickname for his grandfather. And I had no clue what it meant. Is it supposed to be a reference to his, appearance? Is it supposed to be a reference to his position? Whatever. So I look up this dictionary and it says, oh, Kumbakattu means wheel hub. Like in old bullock carts, you have this wheel and the central hub of it. And now I have the meaning, but it still doesn't make sense. Why is this man called wheel hub? Is it because he holds an important position in his society and like everyone looks up to him? I sort of like, overthink this,
Yeah.
and then I go and finally hesitantly ask him. And he's like, oh, that's because he was short and stout. I was like, okay. And so, if sometimes this is like really funny, like you come across things that make you think, okay, there must be some very elaborate explanation for this, and uh, the another thing that I really struggled with is a made up song in this novella called Pathalaksham Kalarigal by Jay Mohan, where basically he's kind of given out a two-line verse and said, the song goes something like this. Here I'm just making it up and all of that. But the song is structured like a riddle full of numbers, and those numbers don't add up and those numbers don't make sense. Like, it says like start at 3 and touch up to 20, and I was like, what is that? And so it's supposed to be conveying some calculation, and there's in between Ya Allah coming in and all of that, because this is a song by Mopla Muslims. And I'm like, what is happening there? And I remember I struggled over this for about 1.5 years. Like, I independently checked the literal interpretation of this with six different Malayalam speakers, and each of them gave me a different version for what it means. Because if it had been Tamil, I would have kind of cracked it somewhere, but this is like partially in Malayalam. And then finally, there are all that they keep telling me is, but whatever it is, it doesn't make sense, Aishwarya. And then I go back and ask Jay Mohan, and he's like, yeah, it was not meant to make sense. I'm saying there, no, it's a made up verse. And I'm like, what? I had like, over different times asked so many people that the time I came around to asking another Malayalam friend, she was like, didn't you ask me something like this 1 year ago? And I'm like, oh yeah, sorry, I forgot. I exhausted all of my Malayalam friends and came back to you again a second time. And she's like, you want me to do this again? So it was, when you look at those two lines in the final manuscript, you wouldn't know how long I've been wrangling with this and with how many people. And ultimately, because it's not even making sense, you know. So that's the sort of wild, you know,
Wow.
rabbit holes you get into.
That is terrific. I mean, and one more thing, what I also feel is that my mother tongue is Telugu, but the Telugu that we speak, the one that we use in day-to-day conversations, is very different. When I learned how to read and write Telugu, I mean, the one that's used in stories, the novels, and of course, again, there is a version that is classic. The ones who are very old, like say the 50s and the 60s writers, the Telugu that they use is very different than the Telugu that the ones who are maybe writing recently are using. So again, that's another version of Telugu. So it was a very different world when I tried reading. I literally struggled with that because I have not even heard that kind of Telugu. And most of my family, extended, and my cousins and everyone is lived outside Andhra Pradesh for like almost 10, more than 30 years. So their accent and their pronunciations are again very varied than the people who must have been living there, and they have their accents. Like what I see in Bombay also, the Marathi that they speak here is very different than the Marathi that they use in proper Bombay, or say in a Satara district, or in Pune. Everywhere the Marathi accents also vary so much. That's so fascinating, to see that and the effort that goes back. So let's come back to your translation of Perumal Murugan's memoir, Students Etched in Memory. This is your first full-length work. So how did translating non-fiction, especially something as personal and grounded as a memoir, challenge or expand your understanding of translation as a creative art?
I would say that it helped that the essays were relatively straightforward, and it also helped that he had written them for a newspaper as a column initially. They were originally published in the Tamil version of the Hindu newspaper. So, because of that, the essays were relatively short, and they had like a single point of focus. And like I said, he writes like really tiny sentences, like very to the point, getting his ideas across. And this whole what they call this clear pane of glass idea of prose, that's pretty much there. You would barring a few expressions that are related to, say, some quotations from songs, from folk songs that he's talking about, or like some from classical Tamil or something like that, you would really not struggle with understanding what he's writing. So that was very helpful. And regarding the personal element, it also helped that I had met pretty much the kind of students that he's also dealing with. So
Ah,
that I had kind of written about in my introduction to the book also. In a brief phase of my life, like between jobs, I was a soft skill trainer in rural engineering colleges in Tamil Nadu. Like just a fascinating sort of outing. Some months where I would go stay in these small towns where I would literally have peacocks flying around the campus and all of that. And I met these young, aspiring, you know, young people who really struggle with English. The moment you ask them to speak anything in English, they clam up. And so I could really relate to the sort of students he's writing about. And then I also recognize that there's a layer of privilege even to these people I'm talking about because they were studying engineering, which means like their parents had at least managed to put them through those colleges. And then he had been a teacher in government colleges where these students don't even have their parents paying for their education. They have to work in a mill or factory or something, pay for their own studies and so on. So you see a lot of empathy in his writing. And that is what I tried to preserve in the English version that I wanted to carry it into. So there was not much of flexing with language that was involved, like except where there was some little bit of humor and all of that. So um, how it expanded my understanding of translation is like in terms of how much empathy this demands out of you. As much as we appreciate that from a writer, we don't really see how much empathy is required on the part of the translator to really carry that spirit into writing.
very true. Very true. So, what do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of translation work, especially in the Indian literary context?
Of course, people outside this are going to outside the field of books and publication and all of that, assume that I'm doing a slightly upgraded version of Google Translate,
Ah,
and so that's a lost battle. It can't even argue there. So I just politely smile and move on from there. But recently there was an article by Jayashree Kalathil where she was talking about the amount of invisible labor that goes into this whole process, meaning how much of uncompensated work we do in terms of writing book pitches. Like there are book pitches that I've written that have probably gone into some Orwellian memory hole. I don't even know where they are, who they are with, and what happened to the amount of effort put into that. And at the querying stage of asking people. And sometimes you are commissioned to do a translation, and then people look at the translated version and then realize like maybe not, so not entire book length pieces of course, but like small essays and all of that. And sometimes you send it to some editor and then it just like lies there, and then you don't want to feel like the pushy demon because you already followed up twice and now you want them to probably get back to you, and then you just quietly stay silent about it and so on. So there are all I'm trying to say is what people see in the finished published output is maybe like 40-50% of the actual amount of work that goes into researching, reading up about authors. And also one of the things that I've had to do is to sort of build my background knowledge of Tamil tradition itself over the years. And so there's a lot of obscure books that I'm reading just now, like, Pratapa Mudaliyar Charitram, which is supposed to be the first novel written in Tamil, is something I've just started reading. So, not that I'm ever going to translate that. So, the point is, there's a lot of things you do to enrich your own understanding of both the languages. And that, I suppose, is what you do even in my teaching profession. So, like, research is supposed to be something that goes on in the background. Whether or not you publish your research, there's always a lot of reading and research that goes into the background of your work. And besides that, there are also these like pieces that you write that probably don't get published or just like lies somewhere. And uh, there's a lot of that is pretty much invisible uncompensated labor that many translators do, including myself. And I also know about other friends who kind of like done so much work that uh, probably some other translator has already done and so on. Like for instance, the one very frustrating instance is when an author says, yeah, you can go ahead and translate this book, but they've already said that to somebody else as well. And so there are probably two different people parallelly working on a translation. And I've heard instances where people have expressed their frustration with such things. Like, and this happens to uh, being a very well-known name in a translation circle also doesn't really insulate you from this danger. I've heard really prominent translators kind of running into this kind of issues.
That's a very sad thing. I also have had experiences where authors feel it's unfair to pay so much to translators. Whenever they are like, that's what are they doing? They are just taking it into other language. I've already done the work, and I'm like, no, that's not how it works. That's not what I'm going to pitch for you as a person who's going to approach them on your behalf. If that's your budget, then please leave it. Keep me out of it. At least it's unethical to even say somebody to work on that price what you are offering. So that's also my issue. It's a sad
Oh,
fact.
true. Honestly, when I go into my classes, I tell people like I teach a paper called Translation in Practice at Manipal University. And one of the things I tell them is, look, this is a very exciting thing to do. Do it if you're passionate about it, but please have a day job on the side because this is definitely not going to like, pay even your broadband bills for like maybe half a decade. So, it's going to be there, it's going to be a passion project, and it's probably kind of like, it's going to pay your broadband bill or maybe like, couple of shopping expeditions, maybe if
Maybe.
you're lucky,
Yeah.
you know, in the initial few years. So, like, you're not going to become a JK Rowling with like, translating. I don't think anyone in India has made that kind of a fortune with translating. Even people who've literally translated hundreds of books might still not be making enough to quit a day job sort of thing. So
True. Very true. Very. There's a fine balance between fidelity to the original text and making it accessible or resonant in the target language. So, how do you negotiate that line, especially when you're translating culturally or linguistically dense Tamil texts for English readers?
um I would say this is a much bigger challenge in, say, poetry
Hmm.
as opposed to, say, nonfiction. You know, there is a certain there are so many elements of that original that you're trying to reproduce with different degrees of success. And I I actually enjoy that challenge. Like I remember recently, I was part of a poetry. I mean, as a part of a translating poetry workshop conducted by two Tamil translators from Canada, and they had this very interesting workshop going on online over a series of 6 weeks. It happened in two seasons across last year, and it was very fascinating to see the same poem being translated very differently by very different people. And I realized at that point that uh, if a particular poem has a certain staccato rhythm, I need to try and bring that staccato rhythm in order to sort of bring in that martial element into
Yeah.
that poem. Like, basically, um, there is, for instance, the first properly modern Tamil writer and poet, Subramanya Bharati. He's like a very well-known figure.
Yeah.
And we worked on this poem called Achamillai Achamillai, which translates to no fear, and it was written in defiance of the British, and it was written in the early 1900s. And so there is a certain rhythm to it when it is spoken that doesn't require any kind of emphasis. Just reading it out loud in Tamil would give people exactly the sort of a auditory image of something like a marching army. It's like அச்சமில்லை அச்சமில்லை அச்சமென்பதில்லையே உச்சி மீது வானிடிந்து விழுகின்ற போதிலும். That kind of a
Yeah.
rhythm that's there in the original. And so the challenge then becomes, what do you do in English to try and capture that kind of a rhythm? And then that is also where my training in English literature was really helpful. So I remember exchanging notes with the person facilitating the workshop on, look, I'm trying to use the dactyl, like because dactyl is like one of those meters with heavy opening stress sort of thing. And so I'm using a lot of dactyls here for that sort of a marching rhythm and that kind of thing. And so it really helps to have a big arsenal of tools in your target language when you try and get this effect across. And that's why I feel like my uh, relative unfamiliarity with Tamil doesn't handicap me so much as if I were not very comfortable in English.
Yeah.
Now, that's like a genuine challenge we get to see in a lot of people attempting translation. Like, um, uh, I feel like your grasp of English, I mean, your grasp of your language into which you translate definitely needs to be much, much, much stronger than even your, source language, because that's an area where you can seek help. But this is like your clay. You are working on this. Like nobody else can really help you here. So that's one area where I think my, training in English was really helpful for me. And other than that, in order to be true to the spirit of what is being said and the cultural rootedness, I just have to rely on my instinct. Like, as a Tamil person who's somewhere relating to what is happening, as long as I feel like, the feel the emotional truth of what I'm doing, I hope that it comes through in the English version. But this craft aspect, it really helps to have a very good hold on your on the different kinds of toolkit available to you in your in the language into which you translate. And that is where I think any kind of formal training is also going to help.
Wow. That's a very insightful response there. So, Ishwarya, you've been shortlisted twice for the Modi Prize. What did that recognition mean for you? And more broadly, how important are these awards in supporting translators and bringing more visibility to their work?
I think it's a fantastic initiative because there are very few efforts that recognize translators as such. Like last, when I was reading the newspapers last week, that the JCB price has also just been wound down.
Yeah.
The JCB was like yeah, it came with a big purse, very solid cash reward attached to the award and so on. But I think they were doing a good job with recognizing the translator as much as the original writer. And now, in the case of Heartlamp, you see the prize money is divided equally between the writer and the translator. And these efforts are really important because they sort of foreground the amount of work that's going into this work. And talking about the earlier invisible labor part of it and what is not recognized in translators' works is very often there's a writer whom you cherish in your source language and you feel like, oh God, the world has to know more about this person because how on earth is this person writing so much and nobody else knows what is going on here? And then the amount of work that goes into sort of making that dent, making that name, making that visibility possible, that so many of the translators I know have done for writings that they deeply cherish and value and so on. That is part of the labor that kind of doesn't get any recognition, basically because um, there are so many casual conversations in which you bring up these names and these ideas and like, this is something I've read in Tamil, and then they're like, where can I access this? I remember having this conversation even with one of my collaborators, like academic collaborators in Germany. And then very casually, when I was talking about Gemon, she said this, made the statement very, in a conversation very randomly, that I feel very sad that I'll die without reading this person's works. Just like that, I was talking about the amount of work that exists that he's written in the first place and how it's going to be like a matter of probably decades before anybody who could actually think of getting all of that work into English. And so very casually she said that, and then it struck me as, oh God, so this kind of cultural ambassadors are what uh, translators are, and that kind of work is what Mori recognizes. And so, for instance, it's a prize that rewards your choice of story as much as your skill of translation. So, in that sense, it honors the curatorial role of the translator. And that's a very important thing. Like, not just how you translate, but also what you choose to translate and why, for what reasons you choose to translate that. And so, it was lovely that I was able to, enter twice into the Mori prize contest, because both times I translated a story that deeply moved me, and that was emotionally very important to me. And I could also see the kind of diversity of the nature of stories that had come in. And I also was very encouraged by the jury member, writer Muttulingam, who lives in Canada and runs an organization called Tamil Literary Garden in Canada. He is like probably in his 80s now, and he was so encouraging of my writing that he wanted to make a special mention of the story and so on. And for someone who's doing this as a first timer, it was a huge moral boost that uh, do what I could do something that was personally rewarding, but is also recognized as this important kind of work. So that is something that really spoke to me, and that has then given me access to a lot of other platforms. I went on to apply to a South Asia Speaks Foundation, and that was able, I got that fellowship, and that was able to again put me in touch with so many other writers and translators, get us to peer review each other's work. And I think all of these initiatives are incredibly important for um, a quality translation ecosystem to be sustained, more than what it just does for one person at a time. It's about creating this system. Now, basically, I encourage my students to apply to the South Asia Fellowship and so on, South Asia Speaks. So it's like it builds on from there. And I remember in my very first time of teaching a translation course, there were only 4 students in that class. And instead of their midterm exams, I actually made them all submit a short story to Mori.
Wow.
Yeah, honestly, that was the assessment. Like, I went through their draft before they submitted, but the entire class. It's 4 people, but still, it was a whole class that submitted their stories, and incidentally, 2 of them were longlisted for the prize.
Wow,
So
that's amazing.
yeah, I know they were like incredibly talented kids, and so that was the second time I got shortlisted, and they were both on the long list, and I was like, oh wow, my university is just really riding into this.
True, true. That is
So
amazing, actually.
yeah.
Yeah. Now that you speak about your teaching experiences and the courses and all that you've done, so we are seeing a rise in translation studies programs and workshops across universities in India, which is a very good thing. How do you see this shift as a translator and as an academic? Do you think formal training can reshape how translation is practiced and valued in the literary world?
I think it's very useful in two counts. First, it first of all gives you an introduction to the contemporary landscape of translation for you to know what is happening now and what are the accepted things, like how italics are being frowned upon and how footnotes are out. Like people don't encourage that anymore. So these are things that you would probably struggle to pick up on your own if you are, doing a whole lone march through this. And so that's just keeping up with what is happening in the translation scene, who's working on what, who are the people with whom you can find mentorship. That kind of introduction that it gives you is really important. And second thing is the way it allows other translators to interact, peer review one another's work. For instance, like you said, with this Ahmedabad's program,
Yeah.
I have a bunch of friends who've done that in different batches, like this
Mm.
colleague who took it in the very first batch, and like some personal friends who've done it in subsequent batches, and so on. And they've all spoken about their experiences and how much they valued the kind of feedback they got both from existing professional translators and also from each other on their craft and so on. So it's on those two counts that I think it's really important. Even in the case of my classroom, one of the components of my assessment was to make them peer review one another's work so that they could look at others' work with a critical eye and so on. So I think that's the networking and the community and the mentorship that happens across these planes, like these cross pollination. That I think is really important.
Very true. So, as someone who teaches literature and translation, so how do you bring your translation practice into the classroom? And what do students often find most surprising about the work of a translator?
The rather pleasant surprise, which kicks in probably when they first have a really polished draft, is to sort of realize, oh, this is such a rewarding work, like mentally. But the rather nasty surprise that happens right at the beginning is when they realize, oh my God, there's so much of writing to authors, next of kin if they are dead, and so on. And so, in order to get permission for this translation, and then sometimes you're not even able to track who
Yeah.
published this, and the paperwork part of it, the chasing trails of people, it's beautiful when authors encourage you uh, to go ahead and do this, all the best and all of that. And students, especially when they do that, feel very heartwarming. I mean, find it very heartwarming. But also sometimes it's like really frustrating because um, this is a genuine challenge. There are some of my students who are really not good at the source languages from which they translate. They
Yeah.
won't be able to read the script. They'll have to probably rely on their parents or someone to read their script. And then for the first time, when they need to write a letter in Tamil, that's going to be a very big challenge because these writers probably, there's no guarantee that they'll respond to you if you write to them in English because they must be getting so much of letters. And so this is so funny. Like, this back end process of securing rights for a translation always becomes as a sort of surprise for someone who's attempting it for the first time. You're really lucky if you have an author who's very cooperative and nice, which is what has happened in my experience. I'm very glad for that. But sometimes it can really become onerous.
Wow. I can to an extent relate to this. So I don't talk about this often, but my great grandfather was a very famous writer in Telugu. He's there on Wikipedia and everywhere. And unfortunately, none of us have any rights. We don't have any copies. And I don't know who's the publisher. It's been 4 years rather. 4 years actively I have been trying to locate someone who can get me hold of his works, or who can I can buy them online. Like I've gone, that's one of the reasons why I learned Telugu, because to read and write, because I wanted to see what he has written. I've heard a lot about him, but I'm still not able to. My idea is to get it translated and all, at least one copy for myself if I can, because I think that the family deserves to know him. And this was so embarrassing, you won't believe what happened. I worked with a ghostwriter, and so I was traveling with them to Andhra Pradesh on a project where I was supposed to translate and transcribe the interviews that were in Telugu for them in person. And that's when they introduced me. They heard my surname and they're like, "You are his granddaughter," and I'm like, "Yes." And I got a standing ovation. And I was like, "Oh shit!" None of us knew he's so big. None of us knew. And I'm like, so they told us that we were very embarrassed because he literally squandered all his money. There is no money in writing. And last May, most of his last days he spent in drinking, and then he was forgetful. And so we never wanted anybody to enter this field or talk about this. And this was like a dark chapter, which we were not very happy about sharing with everyone. And I'm like, but that standing ovation speaks of something very different than the version that you've given me. They're like, we know that, or there are a lot of children who have grown up on this story. So he was a kid's writer. So there are a lot of kids who've grown up on those writings, but I hope someday I do get there somewhere. So yeah, I can relate to what you're saying. It's very difficult to find and trace that original writer or even the publisher. I cannot even imagine what a translator was be going through. Because when you just told me, that you wrote to Perumal Murugan asking what is this the word that you meant, or that's when I was wondering, what if the writers are not alive? What if you pick up some that was the immediate thought that my mind connected in that way. So
True, so true.
yeah,
I had friends like this, like, who are working on, say, in Marathi. I have a friend, Cyrus, who's working on the earliest Dalit writings in Marathi, and the author is long gone. And,
yeah.
sometimes we have to puzzle over these things. And he's like, he's done something a certain way. And I'm like, are you sure that's what this means? And he's like, yeah, at this point, we are the arbitrator. We have to decide what it means, Aishwarya. It's okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There has to be the decision that we need to take. So, Ashwarya, before we wrap this up, the last question for this session: is there a line or a moment from any of your translations that stays with you? Something that captures why you do this work every time?
Yes, definitely. Thank you for that. That's a lovely question. Um, this is something really close to my heart. So, honestly, the very first story that I translated, uh, it still stays very much with me, simply because there's a moment when you realize, especially with the story, that it is talking about, like, I can tell you briefly about what the story is about, and then, it'll all probably make sense. So, I translated this story when I was stuck in a particularly dead end job, and, like, I was day in day out, just clocking into work, doing nothing inspiring, and so on. So, at that point, I read the story and it really moved me to tears. And so this story is about a drunken carpenter who's kind of, like, just like a layabout, pretty much like a wastrel, and everybody disrespects him. Nobody even gives him work to do because he's likely to ruin it, sort of thing. And so, right enough, he kind of comes and pesters a lady, pretty rich lady, to kind of give him some food, and in exchange for the food, he's willing to do any kind of work, sort of thing. That's the level he's been reduced to. And so he sort of then offers to make a ladder, but long story short, ends up wasting even the bamboo pieces given to him to make the ladder, because he does such a horrible job of it. However, you realize that in the break he takes between doing that ladder, he is sculpting an entire masterpiece on red sandalwood.
Wow.
Okay. And the truth is, he's screwing up this job simply because it is uninteresting to him, and it is the sort of job that earns him literal bread. And it's like our very uninspiring day jobs in which many creative people are caught. And then you do it under pressure and you do it badly, and then, you get dissed for it and so on. But there is a moment when you realize the creative genius behind his work. He's forced to abandon that masterpiece basically because they call his bluff on how he's messed up this ladder, and he has to sort of run away from the scene literally halfway. But before that, there's a moment when you see him sculpting in that red sandalwood. He's doing an entire dancing Nataraja scene with Kali and with the little skull garland on her, neck and all of that. And like this, an entire elaborate scene he's sculpting in the middle of his break time from making a ladder.
Yeah.
And at some point, there is a moment when this description of his sculpting that scene becomes a metaphor for all artists.
Wow.
It just becomes a transcendent experience from how his sculpting hands are compared to the hands in heaven that are constantly creating things upon earth,
Right.
and how the world is being chiseled by the hands of a master sculptor far above, and how every creative artist is actually channeling that in. And that becomes to me like a very Coleridgean metaphor for, the primary and the secondary imagination that he talks about. Your primary imagination is that godly state of transcendent moment of art that you experience, and then there is the craft in which you are bringing that alive and so on. But all of us live in a reality where this will be interrupted and you will be challenged on your ladder, your performance metrics, your Excel sheets, the boxes to be ticked, you know. So that is a particular, moment of story that I translated that has stayed with me forever. And it kind of tells me that what I do has meaning,
That's such
So,
a powerful story. I actually had goosebumps when you just explained this because I'm sure, as you said rightly, this is the story of every creative person who's stuck in a day job to earn their bread while actually their heart wants to do something else.
so that I think is the most moving moment that has stayed with me in translation, which keeps reminding me of what I am as a person and what I want to achieve in life. And, there are many other things we do, many other things that we get judged for, like this drunken man whose wife has abandoned him and who's like now penniless and so on. And like there are so many external circumstances about us that leave us open to judgment all the time. But nevertheless, there's something that makes it all worthwhile.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was very powerful and very beautifully said. And with that, we will wrap up this episode. That was Ishwarya, translator, critique, and someone deeply committed to the craft of carrying meaning across languages with care and clarity. If today's conversation made you think differently about the invisible labor behind translations or introduced you to a writer you would like to read in translation, we would love to hear from you. I'll be sharing her details, her social media handles. Please do follow and support their work. You've been listening to In Other Words, where every episode is a step into another linguistic world. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, keep reading and keep listening between the lines.